Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking from the East Midlands in the UK, but normally I'll be speaking from Eora land in the Gadigal Nation, which is a part of Sydney where the Haberfield seminar will be held. I'll just comment a bit on Romeo's presentation. The Australia 2 boat race, America's Cup 1983, was a really monumental event in the Australian country. For our family, it was the year Bron took out Australian citizenship in central Queensland. And the Prime Minister, who is a bit of a, it's an Australian word, larrikin person, he gave the whole country a public holiday on that day as well. That's how important that event was. Also, that another slide you showed, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. You get a chance to watch that movie. It really shows you the cultural landscape of outback Australia. And it was taken, a lot of that was done in a town called Broken Hill, where Australian Icomos had a fantastic conference about dealing with places in isolated locations. Now, ironically, the pub where that film starts has just been sold, and it's very close to Haberfield, where that hotel was. The next thing you mentioned was the Gulf of Carpentaria and the Cartier Foundation art exhibition, which in Australia at the moment, there is a very big current debate going on about recognition of our Indigenous peoples and a proposal to change the Constitution to recognise our Indigenous peoples. And that referenda will be happening about the time of the General Assembly in Sydney in 2023. So there will be a lot of chatter and talk about this. The Aboriginal people weren't acknowledged even in census data until 1969. So at the moment, there is a lot of debate about this, and this is probably why the Cartier Foundation picked up on these political issues happening at the moment. And the other issue that was raised when I was discussing this with Romeo is this term in Australia called since white settlement, which Romeo found quite intriguing as a term. So I will now go through, hopefully, look into some of these ideas about since white settlement. Last year, Noel Pearson, who is an advocate of the referendum coming up this year in support of an Indigenous voice to Parliament, that means that there would be within the Constitution would be a council of Indigenous persons from all over the continent who will advise the federal government on various matters. The federal government does not necessarily have to take that advice. As in most political systems, they have advisors from all over the place, but it would be enshrined in the Constitution so that if and when there is a change of government, they cannot then disband this group of people. They must always have this group of people advising them on matters pertaining to Indigenous persons. But Noel Pearson gave a very insightful series of lectures last year about this political issue in Australia since white settlement. And these are the three terms he used in his lectures: Indigenous foundations, British institutions, and multicultural migrations. he has acknowledged, as do a lot of other representatives from our Indigenous peoples, that we are a multicultural nation and across the entire continent. If you get a chance to listen to his Boyer lectures, please do. They're accessible on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC website. And they canvass a whole range of issues. So I am using Noel Pearson's tri-eyed approach to shared heritage, using his words. This is an Indigenous map of the Australian continent. As Mario said, the Australian continent stretches from Portugal over to beyond Istanbul, from the Mediterranean up into the Nordic countries.
Romeo.
Sorry, Romeo. My son-in-law is Mario, so I'm getting confused between a Romeo and a Mario. And as you can see, there are many, many different nations across this continental area. Just as in Europe, both East Europe and West Europe, you have many different nations. And some are big and some are small. And there is a great variety between these peoples and their cultural artifacts, the way their lifestyles, and etc. Now, you will see down in you'll see, is that Sydney? Oh, southeast, where you can, I don't have a pointer, unfortunately, but over there on the right-hand side, down there, you have see southeast. Down where that says southeast is about where Sydney is. And as you can see, the closer these nations are to the coast, they are smaller because they had more natural resources in which to support their nations. And for example, on the coastal side, they had all the seafood, etc. While in the center of the country, which is a much more arid environment, they have to deal with different resources. So when we talk about the Australian Indigenous peoples, we talk about it in the plural, not in the singular, because there are many, many different ones. Also, when you look down at the southeast, if you just go in a bit, there's this light browny color. That is the Wiradjuri tribe where I work. And if you just go slightly above it, there's a light yellow area. And that is the Kamilaroi area where I also work, which are larger groups. All right, this talk is actually to give you a bit of a foundation on the geopolitical history of the Australian continent since white settlement. So the Australian continent for a long time in Western European thinking was basically called Terra Australis, meaning the Great South Land. And I think I prefer to actually, throughout this talk about the Great South Land as opposed to Australia, because people are getting muddled up between the nation of Australia and the continental landmass of Australis. The Indigenous peoples have been here for at least 65,000 years. The Terra Australis Latin is on many European maps from at least the 15th century. And in 1664, a French map actually divided the continent into two parts, New Holland on the east side and Terra Australis on the west side. Interesting, by then, New Holland being on the east side is further away from Old Batavia, which is Jakarta in Indonesia, or the Dutch Spice Islands. But there have been many contacts to the continent prior to white settlement. The fishermen and traders from the Malaccas and the Indonesian archipelago have been coming in and out of the continent and through the island chains for centuries. The Southeast Asians came, especially for southern China, Vietnam, etc. And the first recorded on paper arrival of European contacts is 1606. Again, looking for produce that they could take back into Europe. I've been reading a big tome of a book, it's literally about this thick, by Professor Frank, or whatever his name is, and he talks a lot about, it's over there, about the colonial attitude of the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, and how that spanned out over the whole world. Shared World Heritage went to Vigan in northern Philippines, which is a World Heritage Center, and Vigan demonstrates the many cultural overlays coming from Southeast Asia through the archipelago down into Australia. So Vigan itself was for a long time a Spanish colony. It was a province of Mexico and administered from Mexico. Then the Americans came, and of course the Chinese have been trading in and out of the Philippines, what we call the Philippines today, for centuries. And when we went to Ximen in southern China, we could see the cultural connections between Ximen and Vigan. Going back to European overlays of thinking, this is a map from 1864 that I mentioned before. You can see how the continent has been partly charted, and they aren't quite sure how Tasmania, New Zealand, and the Gulf of Carpentaria, which is where Romeo was referring to that Foundation's Cartier art exhibition was. But this also shows you a list of European contacts from the 17th century and the beginning of the different names for this continental mass, for a long time called New Holland. Why? Because the Dutch were very active in the Spice Islands, based in Batavia, which had been a World Heritage nomination. Also, the names that you still see on the Australian maps, such as the Torres, as in the strait between the pointy bit of Australia and New Guinea, is still called the Torres Strait. The wreck of the Batavia, the boat, the ship, in 1629 left major, which was over on the Western Australian side. And that's where there is some of the first European relics of being on the continent. And it was a very unpleasant affair, the Batavia. Ended up in cannibalism and all sorts of nastiness. And of course, the English trader Dampier came in trying to find, again, produce to take back to Europe. They were interested in exploiting the natural resources rather than settlement at that time. This is on a map on the floor of the town hall in Amsterdam, which shows this map and how important this map was to navigators of this era. At this time, maps were almost, they were highly prized and very political. If you'll find trading in maps, you'd be into prison, because a map was such a valuable resource for any country. And of course, this is the heyday of the power of the Dutch through their East Indies colonies. So I'm just putting Australia again into a Eurocentric context, because a lot of colonialism is based at the moment is perceived as being Eurocentric. And just thinking about your history, Captain Cook, the English sailor, came along the east coast of Australia in 1770. And he notionally called the whole of the eastern side of the continent New South Wales. Wales as in the part of the island of Britain, South and New, etc. But around about this time, you've also got the American War of Independence, which made a big dent for the Brits because they did not have anywhere to send their convicts anymore, and they had to find somewhere else to put them. You've also got the French Revolution happening at this time, and that is a consideration. So in 1788, the English decide to send convicts to Australia. Now, these people could have been convicted of, in the late Georgian era of England, could have been convicted of quite minor offence, but the civil society at that time was very punitive. So if you stole a loaf of bread, or if you sucked up something quite minor, you could be sent off to Australia for 7 years, thinking that if you went to the other side of the world, you were very unlikely after 7 years to try to get back. And that's if you survived it anyhow. But the other issue happening at this time is the Napoleonic Wars. And this will come out in my next slide as to why there was this tussle between the English and French. But the English also wanted, as well as a place to put their convicts, they wanted a naval base in the Pacific region, because not only were they concerned about the French, they were also concerned about the Russians at the time. And they were coming down into this area as well. Again, as with the Dutch, they were after raw products to take back into the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And after the Napoleonic Wars, the English also had another problem as well as convicts. They had a lot of soldiers who were unemployed, creating havoc in towns, and they needed somewhere to get rid of them too. Now, the other thing about when they came to Australia, and you learn a bit more about Australian history, is our early platoon of soldiers were called the Rum Corps. Why? Because they were paid in rum. And where is the rum coming from? The West African Triangle, of course. The ships go out from Bristol or Bordeaux, for example, down to West Africa, pick up their cargo, human cargo, take it across to the West Indies, exchange that cargo for sugar, and bring the sugar and chocolate back into Europe to make rum and sugar-based products and chocolate, etc. So that triangle has an effect on Australia. And if you see the early convicts were from all over the then colonized powers, including West Africans, with some of our first early convicts. Now, I alluded to this issue between the English and the French, and we were very, very close to being almost French. This book was produced 2 or 3 years ago. There have been a few others about showing how much the French were interested in the Great Southland at this time. And this is Baudouin. I probably can't pronounce his name very well. And this is some indication of the still lingering French links, especially in place names around the continent. Bougainville, and as in the capital in New Guinea, of the islands on the eastern side. And he was the first to map the Great Barrier Reef, for example. The French made a claim to what the Dutch called Dirk-Hartog Island, which is now Tasmania. The French map of 1811 has all sorts of Australian place names that still exist, such as in Sydney, La Perouse, and for the General Assembly 1923, there is a special excursion down to La Perouse, which is the big bay south of Sydney Harbour, called Botany Bay, which is where the English first landed and found that there wasn't a great place for a settlement. And that's when they moved slightly north into what we now call Sydney Harbour, where the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge is. And in that bay, at one stage, we had both the French and the English, both in Botany Bay at the same time. You've got Baudouin. He had been very influential in India and in China, where he'd been collecting botanical samples for the Archduke of Austria. This is the Habsburg Empire. And also he took back artifacts from Australia for the Empress Josephine's collections, such as kangaroos and wombats. But the reason why, in very simplistic essence, the French did not stay on the Terra Australis, the Great South Land, is because they were dealing with their own revolution and the after effects of their own revolution. And the English jumped in faster because they had more imperatives about their battles with the Americas, etc. So it's just the fluke of circumstances that we ended up with an English foundation, not a French one. I mentioned the sugar and the trade, the Atlantic trade or West African Triangle, whatever one wants to call it. Kereme, a couple of years ago, organised a conference in Fiji, and in Fiji is the Australian Colonial Sugar Refinery, and it's still, Fiji is still dependent on sugar. But there is, in Cuba, when we went to Cuba for Shared Built Heritage, there is a whole settlement named Australia. It's predominantly named, most of their colonial refineries were named after continents, but this one still exists with Australia written down its funnel. Now, once we get past what we call the colonial period in Australia, which goes to about 1840. So we're going from 1788 to 1840. This is when we get the next big wave of immigration that is coming from persons other than convicts or military personnel to govern a colony. And this is because of gold. And for the Chinese, it's called New Gold Mountain. Old Gold Mountain is the Californian gold rush, which happened a little bit earlier. But once the Californian gold rush petered out, a lot of those people from California all fled over into Australia. And the miners not only went to gold, but they went to all sorts of other precious metals. And this is where you get the foundations of towns like Broken Hill, where we had that conference, where Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, the film, was based in, and other groups form settlements. So in Tasmania, for example, is a trail around northeast Tasmania called the Tail of the Tin Dragon, which again is Southeast Asian, Cantonese, predominantly Chinese, who came out to do that mining. The Chinese have a different issue with, especially in mining, because mining tends to be, I'm in it for myself and, get away for everyone. But to do a gold mine, especially surface alluvial gold, you have to have water, and to have water, you have to have that water moving. So you get what they call races to keep the water moving. And to build a race to get the fall of water, you actually have to work communally, collectively. And the Chinese were better at doing that than some of the Europeans. So that leads into, well, I'll talk to a bit later about the Federation of Australia in 1901, and going back to this political discussion that we're having at the moment about recognition of the Indigenous nations. But the other thing the gold rush brought is incredible wealth into the country, as well as all these people flooding in.
Melbourne became one of the wealthiest cities in the world. And when I did the World Heritage Assessment at Reims, the Vineland cultural landscape, and we went into some of the caves of the Champagne. One of the people was, again, this was started by the woman, I can't remember which her name was, but the most prominent alleys inside these Champagne underground cellars, the bigger the alley, the more important the city where their exports went. And one of the biggest alleys in this particular one was called Melbourne. And that showed how much champagne was being moved from France to Melbourne during the gold rush and how important it was to that business. On the other side, it's a bit an indication of population and how it changed between 1851 and 1861 to demonstrate how many people are flooding into a country from all over the world. The other thing that migrants brought, as well as their hunger to be wealthy quickly from finding gold, is that they brought in new technologies and they brought in ideals about how a country or a society should be organized depending on where they came from. So they bring in a lot of democratic ideals that are coming out of the Age of Enlightenment and the mid-19th century. Now, just not now a bit about the built aspect of Australia. When the English first came to Australia, they started building things as though they were built in England. So, for example, they faced their main entrance to their buildings to the south. That wasn't a great idea in a place like Tasmania, where the next place after Tasmania is the Antarctic, because the wind goes straight in and into the house. It would be bitterly cold. So they had to reorganize and work out that they were no longer in the northern hemisphere, they're in the southern hemisphere. Also, they built houses with no eaves. So when you get torrential rain, the water's falling straight down the wall of the building, causing problems. They had to change things. The other thing is the English are coming out of their British Empire in the Indian subcontinent and the experiences there. They're bringing both the military campaigns from the Indian subcontinent, but also the housing styles. So the Indian bungalow becomes very, very important in the Australian vernacular. And these are some early examples of buildings that are listed in the Australian context. This is the top one is Elizabeth Farm at Parramatta. That is also open during GA 23. And that shows you the bungalow style with the wraparound veranda, which you still find today. Even in new builds, they'll still build a house with a veranda around it. Also open for the GA 23 is Old Government House at Parramatta. And that's a painting of Old Government House in about 1820. And as it is today, that was the home, the main settlement for the governor of the colony of New South Wales. At this time, the colony of New South Wales was the entire eastern side of the continent. These are also showing that Australian in the early 19th century is still coming out of the influence of the Georgian era. In England, the architectural styles are named after the reigning monarchs at the time. And there was throughout the 17th and 18th century was a whole series of kings called George. And hence you get this Georgian name. They tend to be very symmetrical, very neoclassical. And again, these places, Fern Hill will be open for those people taking the vernacular, ISC vernacular, have a tour out at Western Sydney at the base of the Blue Mountains, and Fern Hill is one of those. Also Elizabeth Bay House, which has now lost its curtilage, it's lost its cultural setting, but that was a major house built on a prominent point in Sydney, which is now very high rise. And you just see at the top of that photo a glimpse of the high rise, which is dwarfing today that house. This is another house built on the cusp between the Georgian and the next era in Australia. This is Yasmar, which is in my suburb in Haberfield. It is a state item. And you can see the bungalow evidence, the wraparound veranda. It's in sandstone. And my community has been waging a campaign to conserve this building for many, many decades. As I said, since white settlement and into the gold rush, there are a whole lot of different national groups that come into the country. Now, the Irish were always part of the Australian convict settlement because England had, for the Irish, colonised Ireland, and they took over a lot of the land. They displaced a lot of the peasants. So you get a lot of Irish coming out to Australia either as convicts, they come out after the potato famine, and they come out as political prisoners because the English want to get the Irish away from the English as much as they can. And you get a lot of markers throughout, especially in New South Wales. These are from where I work. This hotel in Grenfell, which is in 2020, I was going to take you out to this town, but this wasn't going to happen in 2023. You get a lot of these iconic two-story wraparound hotels, pubs, and a lot of them were started by two Irish guys, either Tooheys up there or Tooths, and they were absolutely amazing markers. Every country town would have one of these big two-story dominant buildings. But the other markers are also in cemeteries such as that. So the Irish overlay is quite strong throughout the Australian continent. Oh, wrong one. I mentioned New Gold Mountain. Again, in Cairns, up in North Queensland, this is in the tablelands behind Cairns. And Israel Nikomos had a fantastic conference up there dealing with tsunamis and disasters and so forth. But after the gold rush, a lot of the Chinese stayed in Australia and they went out to work on properties, the cooks and market gardens. And again, this bottom one, this tombstone, is also in one of the towns where I work, where there's a major part of the cemetery dealing with Chinese. Now, the Constitution of Australia in 1901 had a clause in it dealing with who could be considered an Australian citizen. And one of the big legacies in the gold rush, and because of their collective way of working, was a reaction against the Chinese. And what they call the White Australia policy was not to deal with the Indigenous people, it was to deal with the Chinese. And different colonies in Australia had different rules. And so some colonies were completely closed to immigration from outside, while others were more permissive. And I'll get back to that later. But the Chinese overlay, and again, it's predominantly that Southeast Asian Chinese and borderline with Vietnam, that area is where most of them came from. And some of our ICOMOS members, like Liz Vines, has done amazing work on the interrelationship and the roots, the trade routes, as in cultural roots, between these two ethnic groups. Another big overlay that came out, and again because of European history, were the Silesians, or from especially that borderland, that moving borders between what was formerly Prussia and Poland. And a lot of those people came out to Australia because of religious persecution. And they laid the foundations for the Barossa area in to the north of Adelaide, and the wine industry that there. So if you're going to Adelaide, go to this area and see the overlay of this Silesian area and how they brought their families out. Now, when the Lutherans, my understanding is that the Archduke who was running Prussia at the time ruled that you could only have one form of Lutheranism. Some people didn't agree with that, So that migrated. They migrated to South Australia because South Australia was very open. It was open to any religious ideals, any ethnic background. It's always been a much more liberal area in those sort of ways. So that a lot of the Lutherans came to South Australia. But when you go into the Barossa, you'll find that some towns might have 2, 3, even 4 Lutheran churches, because they then fragmented as to which version of Lutheranism they're going to practice. So it's an interesting microcosm of migration brought about by religious intolerance. We mentioned up in the beginning, and Mario mentioned, and the Boyo lectures about Indigenous foundations. Unfortunately, our Indigenous peoples have not always been viewed in that way. This is a very famous Australian painter called Russell Drysdale, depicting the living standards of the Indigenous nations in the centre of the country. And this is from a talk I gave to the New South Wales Heritage Network, because in Australia, if you use that term shared, it will automatically have a connection to Indigenous matters, which is different to how ISC, Shared Built Heritage, views its context. So again, this is up towards the northwest of Australia. Again, many peoples came down, Chinese, the Indonesian archipelago. They came down for marine food supply and to take pearls back north. So you've got a lot of Japanese pearl divers. You got the Afghan cameleers. The camels were introduced into Australia because they could through the desert where horses couldn't. So you get a whole lot of Afghan routes and trekking routes throughout the inland area. And this is a place in Western Australia dealing with all those areas that came together. And it is only more recently being integrated into how we view our history. Like all colonial countries, you go through periods of saying, no, this never happened. This is our mindset on where our history is. This is evolving, as in all colonial countries, we are evolving and seeing our history differently, and especially if new information comes to bear. And we're beginning to deal with, quote, places of tragedy. Again, we had a fantastic conference down in Port Arthur in Tasmania after a gunman went crazy and killed a lot of people. So it's Australian ICOMOS has been dealing with places of tragedy for a long time, and we're beginning to catch up with it through this new referenda coming up.
So
this is another place of tragedy.
Can you go to the conclusion?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. Another place of tragedy. I'll flick through that.
Don't take the time, but
yeah, I'll get to it.
Take your time, but
yeah. No, please. Again, Australia wasn't Australia until 1901 were different separate colonies, and each colony had its own rules and its own laws. It didn't become one country until 1901. Again, we had etc. I can share these later on. We've had massive immigration even since then. This year alone, we expect nearly 1 million people to come into Australia in 2023-24 alone. The Maltese is an interesting one. Again, this is just population statistics. Immigrants also included children who came out here. This building is Fairbridge Farm, again, a place of tragedy, but this was designed by a British architect. This is religious places, especially since, especially in the 20th century. You've got the Tin Mosque up there, which is in Broken Hill, which is from the Cameleers area of the 1880s, but you've got these more recent overlays of religious places. Malta, we had a massive immigration of Maltese after the First World War, but in Malta, they don't have timber. So we sent this house to Malta to teach them how to build with timber. So it's a prefab vernacular building that they dismantle and then rebuild, and that's a heritage item on Malta. This garden is open during the GA, and again you can see overlays of ethnic overlays coming out in that. This is a house in my area that is really early. It's showing early building techniques, roundel timbers, what have you. It's a fantastic vernacular building. I don't know if I can save it though. These are just some of the buildings where I work. This is an early 1923 use of concrete. This is again in a town called Moree in the Californian bungalow style. These are all from Moree. These are commercial buildings in Moree. Again. And now I'm at Haberfield, so I can either stop there and come back and talk to you about the GA, or I'll go back to you then, Mario. Thank you.